Hey guys, tonight we're going to take a trip back in time. Not to a grand castle or a bustling city, but straight to the medieval dinner table. Forget any quaint, rustic charm. We're about to uncover why food was awful in the Middle Ages. And trust me, your modern palate is going to be in shock. Imagine biting into stale, gritty bread, the constant, dull flavor of boiled vegetables, and the ever present worry of your next meal. If you think your last diet was rough, you probably wouldn't have survived a single medieval winter without getting seriously hungry. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Tell me where you're listening from in the comments below, and what time it is for you. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. For the vast majority of people in the Middle Ages, the peasants, their diet was defined by crushing monotony. Imagine waking up every day, knowing that your meals would consist primarily of the same few staple ingredients, prepared in the same bland ways. There was no concept of culinary diversity or exciting new flavors. Food was simply fuel for the endless, back-breaking labor that defined your existence. Your ancestors ate to survive, not to enjoy. This pervasive monotony is a common historical fact about the medieval peasant diet. Your daily bread was the cornerstone of every meal. Imagine a coarse, heavy loaf made from rye, barley, or oats, rarely from fine wheat flour, which was often reserved for the wealthy. This bread would be dark, dense, and often contained impurities like grit from the millstones. You'd break off a hunk of it for breakfast, then use it as a kind of edible plate for your lunch and dinner. It was chewy, unyielding, and likely quite bland. This staple, however, provided the necessary calories for your grueling physical labor, albeit with little joy. Alongside your bread, your main sustenance would come from pottage or stew. Imagine a large cauldron simmering perpetually over your open hearth, filled with whatever vegetables were in seasoned cabbage. Onions, peas, beans, or root vegetables. Grains like oats or barley would be added to thicken it. Meat was a rare luxury. Perhaps a bit of cured pork or some eggs if you were lucky, but certainly not a daily occurrence. You'd eat this thick, mushy, and overwhelmingly bland stew with a wooden spoon, day in and day out. The consistency was often soupy, with everything boiled together into a uniform, unappealing texture. The lack of spices was a huge factor in the blandness of medieval peasant food. Imagine a world without the vibrant flavors of pepper, cinnamon, nutmeg, or cloves. These exotic spices were incredibly expensive, imported from distant lands, and reserved almost exclusively for the wealthy elite, who used them as much for status symbols and medicinal properties as for flavor. For you, the peasant, your seasoning would be limited to salt and perhaps locally grown herbs like parsley, sage, or thyme, if you could cultivate them. This severe restriction on flavor profiles made every meal a dull, unexciting experience. This limited access to spices is a common historical fact, differentiating noble and peasant diets. Your water source was also a constant concern. Imagine drinking from a local well, a communal pump, or a nearby river. These sources were often contaminated, leading to a constant low-level battle with stomach ailments. To avoid this, and because it provided calories, ale or beer was a staple drink for all ages, often safer than water. Imagine starting your day with a weak, murky ale, continuing to drink it throughout the day, and ending your evening with more. This wasn't the strong, alcoholic beer of today, but a thinner, fermented beverage that provided hydration and some caloric value. It added to the monotony and likely the general malaise. A particularly disturbing detail is the reliance on famine foods during periods of scarcity. Imagine the gnawing hunger during the lean months of late winter and early spring, when last year's harvest was dwindling and the new crops hadn't yet ripened. In desperate times, people would resort to eating things we would never consider edible bark from trees, acorns, nettles, wild roots, or even dirt mixed with grain to add bulk. These were truly awful, unappetizing, and often nutritionally deficient, but they were a last resort against starvation, highlighting the razor-thin margin of survival for many peasants. The lack of fresh food and the prevalence of a monotonous diet also led to widespread nutritional deficiencies. Imagine suffering from conditions like scurvy due to lack of vitamin C, causing bleeding gums and fatigue, or rickets due to lack of vitamin D, causing bone deformities. These silent forms of suffering, caused by the very food they ate or lacked, further compounded their misery and shortened their lifespans. This unseen impact of diet on health is a crucial, less commonly emphasized detail. A significant academic debate among historians revolves around the precise caloric intake and overall nutritional adequacy of the medieval peasant diet. While the general picture is clear, did regional variations in agricultural practices or access to diverse resources like fishing lead to significant differences in their health and vitality? Researchers use historical records, skeletal analysis, and even experimental archaeology to reconstruct these ancient diets, often revealing a surprising resilience amidst constant hardship. So, as you slowly succumb to the gentle pull of sleep, imagine the constant monotony, the bland flavors, and the underlying hunger that defined medieval peasant food. Your daily meals were a struggle for survival, a constant reminder of the scarcity and hardship of your existence. Your comfortable, varied, and delicious dinner tonight is an unimaginable luxury compared to the truly awful reality of eating in the Middle Ages. Even if your medieval meal started with potentially edible ingredients, the challenges of preservation without modern technology often turned food into something truly awful. Imagine a world before refrigerators, freezers, or even airtight containers, where every scrap of food was a constant battle against spoilage, rot, and vermin. Your methods of keeping food from going bad were primitive, often laborious, and severely impacted its flavor and safety. The primary method of preserving meat and fish was salting. Imagine the arduous process. Fresh meat or fish would be heavily rubbed with large quantities of coarse salt, then packed into barrels. The salt drew out moisture, creating an environment inhospitable to bacteria. However, this came at a huge cost to flavor and texture. Imagine chewing on incredibly tough, intensely salty meat, which would then need hours, sometimes days, of soaking and boiling to make it even remotely palatable. This extreme saltiness and tough texture is a common historical fact for preserved medieval food. Smoking was another common technique, especially for meats like ham or fish. Imagine hanging cuts of meat in a smokehouse, or directly over your hut's open hearth, allowing the smoke to slowly penetrate and dry them. The smoke itself contains compounds that inhibit bacterial growth. While this imparted a distinct flavor, it also made the meat incredibly dry and chewy. You'd be chewing and chewing and chewing just to get through a bite. Drying was essential for grains, vegetables, and some fruits. Imagine laying out grains in the sun, or hanging bundles of herbs and vegetables from your hut's rafters. This removed moisture, preventing mold and rot. However, it also made food incredibly hard and difficult to eat without rehydration. Your fresh vegetables would often be shriveled, tough, and lacking in much of their original flavor and nutrients once dried. This heavy reliance on drying is a crucial detail for understanding the medieval diet. The storage conditions for these preserved foods were far from ideal. Imagine barrels of salted meat stored in damp cellars or unheated sheds, constantly at risk from rodents and insects. Your dried grains might be kept in sacks on the floor, vulnerable to dampness, mold, or infestation by weevils and other pests. The constant battle against rats, mice, and insects trying to get into your precious food stores was a relentless, everyday struggle. A successful raid by vermin could mean hunger for your family. The lack of refrigeration meant that fresh meat and dairy were incredibly perishable. If you were lucky enough to kill an animal, you had to consume it quickly or preserve it immediately. Imagine slaughtering a pig, then frantically salting or smoking as much of it as possible before it's spoiled. Milk would turn sour quickly, often made into cheese or butter as a more stable form of dairy. This forced rapid consumption or laborious preservation meant that fresh food was a fleeting luxury. A particularly disturbing detail related to food preservation was the problem of rancid fats and oils. Imagine using animal fats or butter that had gone rancid due to improper storage. The taste would be foul and acrid, but often it was simply part of the meal, as fresh alternatives were unavailable. Consuming rancid fats could cause digestive upset and contribute to general ill health, adding to the pervasive misery of their diet. This unseen spoilage was a constant issue. The quality of food also deteriorated rapidly. Imagine grains stored over winter becoming stale, damp, or infested with weevils. Your bread, made from such grains, would be tough, gritty, and often contained insect fragments. While today you discard such food without a second thought, for a medieval peasant, every calorie was precious, and nothing could be wasted. You would eat it, mold or weevils included, simply to survive. A significant academic debate among historians revolves around the precise methods and effectiveness of medieval food preservation. Did regional variations in climate and available resources lead to different preservation techniques? How much nutritional value was truly lost in the salting, smoking, and drying processes? Researchers rely on archaeological findings of food remains, as well as surviving historical recipes and inventories, to piece together a more accurate picture, often revealing a sophisticated yet fundamentally limited understanding of food chemistry. So, as you slowly succumb to the gentle pull of sleep, imagine the constant struggle against spoilage that defined medieval food. The pervasive saltiness, the tough textures, the blandness, and the underlying threat of rancidity and infestation. Your modern refrigerator, with its abundant fresh food, is an unimaginable miracle compared to the harsh, laborious, and often awful reality of food preservation in the Middle Ages. Even if your medieval food managed to avoid the perils of spoilage, the journey from field to plate was often fraught with such a shocking lack of hygiene that it was a constant recipe for sickness. Imagine kitchens, whether in a peasant hut or a lord's castle, where cleanliness was an alien concept, and the preparation of food actively introduced contaminants, rather than removing them. Your modern sensibilities about food safety would be utterly horrified by the medieval approach to cooking. First, consider the water used for cooking. Imagine fetching water from a communal well, a nearby stream, or a local pond. These sources were often contaminated by human and animal waste, agricultural runoff, and general refuse. Without any understanding of water purification, boiling for safety, though sometimes done for cooking, wasn't for hygiene primarily. This contaminated water would be used to wash vegetables, prepare stews, and even mix dough. Every spoonful of pottage carried the risk of waterborne diseases like dysentery or typhoid. This fundamental lack of clean water for cooking is a common historical fact. Then there was the issue of personal hygiene of the cooks themselves. Imagine a medieval kitchen staff, whether a peasant wife or a castle cook, working with unwashed hands, often covered in dirt, sweat, or animal grime. The concept of hand washing before preparing food simply didn't exist. Their clothing would be soiled, and their hair might be uncovered. Cross-contamination from raw meat to prepared dishes would be rampant, without any awareness of the dangers of bacteria. This pervasive lack of personal cleanliness in food handling is a truly awful detail. The cooking environment itself was far from sanitary. Imagine a peasant hut with an open hearth in the middle of the earthen floor, where smoke, soot, and ash constantly permeated the air and settled on food. In a castle kitchen, while larger, you'd still find exposed cooking surfaces, open fires, and a constant battle against flies, rodents, and other vermin attracted by the abundant food scraps and lack of proper waste disposal. Raw meat might hang openly, attracting insects. These conditions were perfect breeding grounds for pathogens, ensuring that food, once prepared, was far from pristine. The handling of meat was particularly problematic. Imagine freshly slaughtered animals being butchered directly on uncleaned surfaces, perhaps a wooden block that had seen countless previous uses without proper scrubbing. The meat might then be carried through dusty, dirty environments, exposed to flies. Before being cooked, the lack of refrigeration meant that meat would often be consumed or processed immediately after slaughter, or laboriously salted. Any slight delay, or an imperfect cure could mean the meat was already beginning to spoil, though still cooked and consumed. This precarious handling of perishable goods is a crucial, less commonly emphasized detail. And let's not forget the insects and rodents. Imagine flies buzzing constantly around uncovered food, landing on prepared dishes, and crawling over raw ingredients. Rats and mice were ubiquitous in medieval homes and kitchens, attracted by crumbs and waste. Their droppings and fur could easily contaminate food, carrying diseases that would then be consumed by humans. This constant, pervasive presence of vermin was not merely an annoyance, it was a significant health hazard, yet one that medieval people largely accepted as unavoidable. The tools and cooking vessels themselves often posed hygiene issues. Imagine wooden trenchers, plates, or bowls, rarely thoroughly washed, developing cracks and crevices where food particles and bacteria could fester. Metal pots, while more durable, might be encrusted with layers of old food residue if not meticulously scraped clean. The lack of effective detergents or hot running water made true sterilization impossible. Your eating implements and cooking tools were often themselves sources of contamination. A particularly disturbing detail is the reliance on strong spices by the wealthy, not just for flavor, but often to mask the taste of spoiled or slightly rancid ingredients. Imagine the rich aroma of cloves, ginger, or pepper in a noble's dish. While delicious, some historians argue that these powerful spices also served a practical purpose, covering up the telltale signs of meat that was past its prime, or fat that had gone rancid. This suggests that even the elite, with their greater access to varied foods, still contended with issues of freshness and hygiene, albeit disguised by exotic flavors. A significant academic debate among food historians concerns the actual impact of these hygiene issues on medieval health. While outbreaks of foodborne illnesses were clearly common, how often did specific practices directly lead to death versus chronic malaise? Did different social classes suffer differently from food-related illnesses? While precise epidemiological data is hard to come by, the consensus is that medieval food preparation, by modern standards, was a constant gamble with hygiene, contributing significantly to widespread illness and shorter lifespans. So, as you slowly succumb to the gentle pull of sleep, imagine the medieval kitchen, a place where dirt, disease, and unsanitary practices were commonplace. The constant threat of contaminated water, unwashed hands, and pervasive vermin meant that every meal, from the humblest pottage to the grandest banquet, carried an unseen risk. Your sterile kitchen and food safety standards tonight are an unimaginable miracle compared to the truly awful reality of food hygiene in the Middle Ages, even if your medieval food managed to avoid the perils of spoilage. The journey from field to plate was often fraught with such a shocking lack of hygiene that it was a constant recipe for sickness. Imagine kitchens, whether in a peasant hut or a lord's castle, where cleanliness was an alien concept, and the preparation of food actively introduced contaminants, rather than removing them. Your modern sensibilities about food safety would be utterly horrified by the medieval approach to cooking. First, consider the water used for cooking. Imagine fetching water from a communal well, a nearby stream, or a local pond. These sources were often contaminated by human and animal waste, agricultural runoff, and general refuse. Without any understanding of water purification, boiling for safety, though sometimes done for cooking, wasn't for hygiene primarily. This contaminated water would be used to wash vegetables, prepare stews, and even mix dough. Every spoonful of pottage carried the risk of waterborne diseases like dysentery or typhoid. This fundamental lack of clean water for cooking is a common historical fact. Then there was the issue of personal hygiene of the cooks themselves. Imagine a medieval kitchen staff, whether a peasant wife or a castle cook, working with unwashed hands, often covered in dirt, sweat, or animal grime. The concept of hand washing before preparing food simply didn't exist. Their clothing would be soiled, and their hair might be uncovered. Cross-contamination from raw meat to prepared dishes would be rampant without any awareness of the dangers of bacteria. This pervasive lack of personal cleanliness in food handling is a truly awful detail. The cooking environment itself was far from sanitary. Imagine a peasant hut with an open hearth in the middle of the earthen floor, where smoke, soot, and ash constantly permeated the air and settled on food. In a castle kitchen, while larger, you'd still find exposed cooking surfaces, open fires, and a constant battle against flies, rodents, and other vermin attracted by the abundant food scraps and lack of proper waste disposal. Raw meat might hang openly, attracting insects. These conditions were perfect breeding grounds for pathogens, ensuring that food, once prepared, was far from pristine. The handling of meat was particularly problematic. Imagine freshly slaughtered animals being butchered directly on uncleaned surfaces. Perhaps a wooden block that had seen countless previous uses without proper scrubbing. The meat might then be carried through dusty, dirty environments, exposed to flies before being cooked. The lack of refrigeration meant that meat would often be consumed or processed immediately after slaughter, or laboriously salted. Any slight delay or an imperfect cure could mean the meat was already beginning to spoil, though still cooked and consumed. This precarious handling of perishable goods is a crucial, less commonly emphasized detail. And let's not forget the insects and rodents. Imagine flies buzzing constantly around uncovered food, landing on prepared dishes, and crawling over raw ingredients. Rats and mice were ubiquitous in medieval homes and kitchens, attracted by crumbs and waste. Their droppings and fur could easily contaminate food, carrying diseases that would then be consumed by humans. This constant, pervasive presence of vermin was not merely an annoyance, it was a significant health hazard, yet one that medieval people largely accepted as unavoidable. The tools and cooking vessels themselves often posed hygiene issues. Imagine wooden trenchers' plates or bowls, rarely thoroughly washed, developing cracks and crevices where food particles and bacteria could fester. Metal pots, while more durable, might be encrusted with layers of old food residue if not meticulously scraped clean. The lack of effective detergents or hot running water made true sterilization impossible. Your eating implements and cooking tools were often themselves sources of contamination. A particularly disturbing detail is the reliance on strong spices by the wealthy, not just for flavor, but often to mask the taste of spoiled or slightly rancid ingredients. Imagine the rich aroma of cloves, ginger, or pepper in a noble's dish. While delicious, some historians argue that these powerful spices also served a practical purpose, covering up the telltale signs of meat that was past its prime, or fat that had gone rancid. This suggests that even the elite, with their greater access to varied foods, still contended with issues of freshness and hygiene, albeit disguised by exotic flavors. A significant academic debate among food historians concerns the actual impact of these hygiene issues on medieval health. While outbreaks of foodborne illnesses were clearly common, how often did specific practices directly lead to death versus chronic malaise? Did different social classes suffer differently from food-related illnesses? While precise epidemiological data is hard to come by, the consensus is that medieval food preparation, by modern standards, was a constant gamble with hygiene, contributing significantly to widespread illness and shorter lifespans. So, as you slowly succumb to the gentle pull of sleep, imagine the medieval kitchen, a place where dirt, disease, and unsanitary practices were commonplace. The constant threat of contaminated water, unwashed hands, and pervasive vermin meant that every meal, from the humblest pottage to the grandest banquet, carried an unseen risk. Your sterile kitchen and food safety standards tonight are an unimaginable miracle compared to the truly awful reality of food hygiene in the Middle Ages. Even if your medieval food managed to be prepared with some semblance of cleanliness, a far more insidious and widely accepted problem made dining truly awful: the rampant practice of food adulteration. Imagine biting into your meal, unknowingly consuming not just the intended ingredients, but also fillers, dyes, and even dangerous contaminants added deliberately by unscrupulous merchants or producers, all to cut costs or mask poor quality. This was a hidden poison in almost every bite. For the most basic staple, bread, adulteration was common. Imagine bakers adding cheaper, inferior grains like barley or oats to wheat flour, or even worse, mixing in sawdust, chalk, or finely ground beans to increase the weight and volume, effectively cheating their customers. Sometimes dirt or grit from poorly maintained millstones would be unintentionally included, adding an unappetizing crunch and accelerating tooth wear. You would be consuming these fillers daily, unknowingly, just to fill your belly. This practice of cutting bread is a common historical fact. Meat and fish were also frequent targets. Imagine butchers adding older, cheaper cuts of meat to a seemingly fresh batch, or even using offal and scraps to bulk up sausages. Fishmongers might spray old fish with water to make them appear fresher, or cover them in herbs to mask the smell of decay. The lack of proper refrigeration meant that spoilage was a constant battle, and adulteration was a desperate, if dishonest, way to extend shelf life or hide the signs of decay. You might think you were eating fresh meat when, in reality, it was already past its prime and potentially teeming with bacteria. This deceptive practice is a truly disturbing detail. Beverages were not immune. Wine, especially, was often adulterated. Imagine unscrupulous vintners adding water to their wine to increase volume, or mixing in cheaper, inferior wines. Sometimes more dangerous substances were added to alter the color or taste, such as lead acetate sugar of lead to sweeten sour wine, a slow-acting poison that could lead to lead poisoning over time, causing abdominal pain, neurological damage, and even death. You'd be drinking this tainted wine, perhaps daily, unaware of the silent killer lurking within. This is a crucial, less commonly emphasized detail. Even ale and beer, the daily drinks for most, could be adulterated. Imagine brewers adding cheaper grains, or even bizarre ingredients like ground-up oyster shells or chalk to increase the apparent strength or cloudiness. While less lethal than lead, these additions still affected the quality and sometimes the safety of the drink. The consumer, relying on these staples, had little recourse or knowledge to detect such widespread fraud. The motivation for adulteration was almost purely economic: to save money, increase profits, or make inferior products appear more valuable. Imagine a baker facing high grain prices, choosing to mix in sawdust rather than lower his profit margin, or a vintner adding lead to salvage a batch of sour wine. The consequences for the consumer, however, ranged from mild digestive upset to chronic illness and death. A unique and particularly awful detail of medieval food adulteration was the lack of regulation and enforcement. While some medieval towns and guilds had rudimentary laws against cheating customers, these were often difficult to enforce, and punishments were inconsistent. Imagine a corrupt official turning a blind eye to fraudulent practices, or a powerful merchant escaping punishment due to their influence. For you, the common person, there was little protection against these deceptive practices, and even less ability to identify them. You just ate what you were given, hoping it wouldn't make you ill. The widespread nature of adulteration contributed significantly to the poor health of the medieval population. Imagine a constant, low-level exposure to contaminants, combined with a generally poor diet and unsanitary conditions. This created a perfect storm for chronic illness, digestive issues, and nutrient deficiencies. While specific links are hard to prove, it's clear that food adulteration was a silent, pervasive health hazard. A significant academic debate among food historians concerns the precise prevalence and lethality of various adulterants. While textual sources hint at widespread practices, Quantifying their exact impact on public health is challenging. Did certain regions suffer more from specific types of adulteration? How did it change over time with evolving trade practices? Researchers use chemical analysis of historical food residues and legal documents to piece together a more accurate picture, revealing a surprising level of intentional deceit in medieval food production. So, as you slowly succumb to the gentle pull of sleep, imagine the pervasive, unsettling reality of food adulteration in the Middle Ages. The hidden fillers, the dangerous additives, and the constant risk of unknowingly consuming contaminated meals, all for the sake of profit. Your secure, highly regulated food supply tonight, with its clear labeling and safety standards, is an unimaginable miracle compared to the truly awful and often deceitful reality of medieval dining. Even with the challenges of basic food and the risks of adulteration, the medieval peasant's life was dictated by a far more profound and terrifying reality: the relentless cycle of seasonal scarcity and constant hunger. Imagine living on the knife edge of survival, where your very existence depended entirely on the whims of the weather and the success of a single annual harvest. This was a perpetual state of precariousness, often swinging wildly between meager subsistence and outright famine. The agricultural year for a medieval peasant was rigidly structured around the seasons. Spring was a period of intense labor, plowing, sowing, and hopeful anticipation, but it was also often a time of lean months, where the previous year's harvest was dwindling rapidly, and the new crops were not yet ready. Imagine the gnawing hunger in your belly, day after day, as your family rationed every last scrap of grain, hoping it would stretch until the first vegetables ripened. This was a common, agonizing period of scarcity, a truly awful detail of their annual cycle. Summer brought warmer weather and the promise of new growth, with fresh vegetables and fruits becoming available. This was a brief period of relative abundance, a welcome respite from the hunger of spring. Imagine savoring the taste of fresh berries or newly picked peas, a rare treat in your monotonous diet. However, even in summer, the threat of drought or pest infestations loomed large, capable of destroying your nascent crops before they reached maturity. The most crucial period was autumn harvest time. Imagine the frantic, back-breaking labor as the entire village, including every available man, woman, and child, toiled from dawn till dusk to bring in the ripened grain. This was a race against time and the impending bad weather. A successful harvest meant survival for another year. A poor one meant inevitable hunger, perhaps even starvation during the coming winter. This desperate reliance on a single annual event is a common historical fact. Winter was the most challenging season. Imagine the bitter cold seeping into your unheated hut and your dwindling food stores. While meat might be available if you had slaughtered livestock, it was often tough and heavily salted. Fresh produce was non-existent. You would largely subsist on dried grains, hard bread, and preserved meats. Always rationing, always stretching, praying for spring to arrive before your meager supplies ran out. The cold compounded the hunger, making every day a test of endurance. The impact of unpredictable weather was catastrophic. Imagine a prolonged drought withering your crops in the fields, or torrential rains rotting them before harvest. A sudden, early frost could destroy an entire year's labor overnight. These natural disasters beyond your control were direct threats to your family's survival. Without modern irrigation or diversified food sources, a single bad season could tip an entire village into famine. This profound vulnerability to climate is a truly brutal detail. A unique and particularly disturbing detail is the practice of famine foods in extreme desperation. As we briefly touched upon, when true starvation set in, people would resort to consuming things we would consider utterly inedible and often harmful. Imagine foraging for tree bark, acorns, wild nettles, or even clay, grinding them into a meager paste or mixing them with scarce grain, simply to fill the gnawing void in your stomach. These foods offered little nutrition and often caused severe digestive distress, but they were a last horrifying resort to prolong life by mere days or weeks, a testament to the extremes of human suffering. The consequences of constant hunger and malnutrition were severe. Imagine your body constantly feeling weak and fatigued, your immune system compromised, making you highly susceptible to every passing disease. Chronic malnutrition could lead to developmental problems in children, shortened lifespans, and a pervasive sense of malaise that permeated every aspect of life. Even if you didn't die directly from starvation, the constant battle against hunger made you perpetually vulnerable. A significant academic debate among historians revolves around the precise frequency and severity of famines in the Middle Ages. While local scarcities were common, did widespread regional famines occur regularly, or were they more isolated events? The lack of precise demographic data makes quantification challenging, but chronicles and archaeological evidence suggest that large-scale famines, often exacerbated by war or disease, were a recurring and terrifying feature of medieval life, claiming millions of lives over centuries. So, as you slowly succumb to the gentle pull of sleep, imagine the constant gnawing of hunger, the relentless rhythm of scarcity, and the terrifying shadow of famine that haunted the medieval peasants' every waking moment. Your access to abundant year-round food tonight is an unimaginable miracle compared to the precarious, often awful reality of subsistence in the Middle Ages. Even after you, a medieval peasant, had harvested your crops and stored what little you could. The act of preparing and consuming your food presented another layer of awful reality, the primitive, often unsanitary, and incredibly laborious methods of cooking. Imagine your hut filled with smoke, your hands perpetually grimy, as you tried to transform raw, bland ingredients into something edible. Without the benefit of modern kitchens or precise cooking tools, your primary cooking tool was the open hearth in the center of your hut, or perhaps a simple fire pit outside. Imagine building a fire daily, carefully balancing pots over the flames or burying food in the embers. There were no stoves, no ovens unless you paid to use the Lord's communal oven, and no temperature controls. Cooking was an art of intuition, constantly adjusting logs, fanning flames, and guessing at cooking times. The constant presence of smoke filling your hut, escaping only through a hole in the roof or permeating the thatch, was a daily reality. This smoke, while preserving some meats, also coated everything in soot and posed a health risk to your lungs and eyes. This open hearth cooking is a common historical fact for peasant households. The main method of cooking was boiling. Imagine your daily pottage or stew simmering endlessly in a large, often cast iron or earthenware pot. Everything would be thrown in together, grains, vegetables, a rare scrap of meat, and boiled until soft. This created a uniform, mushy texture, often lacking distinct flavors because everything was cooked together for prolonged periods. The consistent boiling ensured that most of the food was cooked through and safer to eat, killing some pathogens. But it also stripped away nutrients and resulted in a bland, unappetizing meal. This heavy reliance on boiling is a crucial detail of their monotonous diet. Roasting and baking were luxuries. Imagine if you had a bit of meat, perhaps a rabbit you had snared at great risk of punishment. You might try to roast it over the open fire on a spit. This would provide a rare moment of varied texture and flavor. Baking bread was a laborious process, usually done in communal ovens in the village, owned by the Lord, for which you had to pay a fee. Imagine hauling your prepared dough to the oven, waiting for it to bake, and then carrying your heavy loaves back home. This added another layer of time and cost to your most basic food staple. The lack of precise measurements and recipes as we know them today also made cooking more challenging. Imagine learning to cook by observation, by feel, and by the imprecise instructions passed down orally through generations. There were no cookbooks filled with exact ingredient lists or temperature guidelines. It was a craft learned through endless repetition and adaptation to available resources, often relying on trial and error. This reliance on inherited wisdom rather than written instructions is a unique, less common detail. Hygiene in the cooking process was, as we've discussed, almost non-existent. Imagine your hands, soiled from fieldwork, directly handling food ingredients. Vegetables might be simply rinsed with potentially contaminated water, if at all. Meat might be cut on a well-used, uncleaned wooden block. Spoons and eating vessels would be rinsed, but rarely truly cleaned, developing a patina of grime and old food residue. The constant presence of flies, attracted by the smells of cooking and the lack of proper waste disposal, would inevitably land on food. This pervasive lack of cleanliness in every step of cooking made every meal a gamble with your health. This is a truly awful and disturbing detail. The quality of cooking tools was also rudimentary. Imagine using heavy, unwieldy iron pots, wooden spoons, and simple knives. These tools, while functional, made precise cooking difficult. There were no delicate whisks, fine sieves, or temperature-controlled ovens. The results were often coarse textures, unevenly cooked food, and a pervasive lack of refinement. The very act of eating was communal and functional. Imagine your family gathered around the central hearth, perhaps sitting on stools or the floor, sharing a common bowl of pottage or breaking off pieces from a shared loaf of bread. There would be no individual plates beyond perhaps a trencher of stale bread for the wealthy, used as an edible plate. It was a simple, shared moment of sustenance, far from the elaborate dining experiences of the nobility or the varied meals you enjoy today. A significant academic debate among food historians concerns the actual culinary skill of medieval peasants. While their ingredients were limited and methods basic, did they develop subtle techniques to enhance flavor or texture within their constraints? Were certain peasant dishes surprisingly palatable despite their simplicity? While acknowledging regional variations, the consensus is that the primary goal was sustenance, and flavor was often secondary, though they certainly made the best of what they had. So, as you slowly succumb to the gentle pull of sleep, imagine the constant struggle of cooking in the Middle Ages. The smoke-filled huts, the primitive tools, the reliance on boiling, and the ever-present lack of hygiene made every meal an arduous process and a potential health risk. Your modern kitchen, with its clean surfaces, running water, and precise appliances, is an unimaginable luxury compared to the truly awful reality of medieval cooking. Even after the medieval peasant navigated the challenges of monotonous food, primitive preservation, and unsanitary cooking, there was another insidious element that made dining truly awful: the omnipresent danger of contaminated water. Imagine living in a world where every sip of water, seemingly benign, carried a hidden threat of debilitating illness or even death, far more common than any dramatic battle or natural disaster. Water, a fundamental necessity of life, was often a silent killer in the Middle Ages. Your primary sources of drinking water were local wells, communal pumps, nearby streams or rivers. Imagine fetching water from these sources, seeing them often used by livestock, or located near fields, fertilized with manure, or even downstream from other villages or towns. The concept of filtering, treating, or purifying water for drinking was virtually non-existent for the common person. This direct consumption of untreated, often contaminated. Water is a common historical fact. The biggest threat lurking in contaminated water was bacteria and pathogens. Imagine invisible microorganisms, shed in human and animal waste, thriving in these water sources. When you drank, you would unknowingly ingest these pathogens, leading to a host of terrifying waterborne diseases. Dysentery, with its severe diarrhea, dehydration, and abdominal pain, was rampant. Typhoid fever, a systemic bacterial infection causing high fever, fatigue, and intestinal bleeding, was another common killer. You would be constantly battling stomach ailments, fatigue, and fevers, unaware that your very source of hydration was betraying your body. This pervasive threat of waterborne illness is a truly brutal detail. The medieval understanding of disease was based on the humoral theory and the concept of miasma, bad air, not germs. Imagine a physician or healer attributing a severe bout of dysentery to an imbalance of humors, or to foul smells in the air, rather than the contaminated water you just drank. This profound lack of scientific understanding meant that the true cause of widespread illness was never addressed, and people continued to consume unsafe water. perpetuating the cycle of disease. This lack of germ theory understanding is crucial to understanding medieval health. To avoid the dangers of water, ale, and beer became the primary beverages for almost everyone, including children. Imagine starting your day with a weak, murky ale, continuing to drink it throughout the day, often more than water itself. The fermentation process involved boiling the water during brewing, which inadvertently killed most of the pathogens, making it a safer, though still not perfectly clean, alternative to raw water. It also provided much-needed calories for a peasant's arduous life. While safer, it was still a monotonous drink, contributing to your bland diet. This reliance on ale as a safer alternative to water is a common historical fact. However, even ale was not entirely risk-free. Imagine the quality varying wildly, and if the brewing process wasn't thorough, or if the raw ingredients were contaminated, it could still carry pathogens. And the sheer volume consumed, even if low in alcohol, could have its own effects on health and daily functioning. A unique and particularly disturbing detail is the use of urinalysis by medieval physicians, not just for diagnosis, but as a source of clean water. While primarily for examining a patient's health, there are some historical records hinting at desperate situations where human urine, boiled or distilled, might be used for medical purposes, or even as a source of liquid in extreme thirst. While not a common drinking practice, the very thought underscores the profound scarcity of truly potable water and the desperate measures sometimes considered. This is a very rare and gruesome detail. The impact of contaminated water on overall public health was catastrophic. Imagine entire villages being regularly afflicted by waves of waterborne epidemics, decimating populations and leading to chronic ill health and weakened immune systems. This constant low-level exposure to pathogens contributed significantly to the short lifespans and high mortality rates of the medieval population, making life a constant battle against unseen environmental threats. A significant academic debate among historians and public health scholars concerns the precise prevalence and impact of various waterborne diseases in the Middle Ages. How often did localized outbreaks become widespread epidemics? Did the reliance on ale truly mitigate the dangers, or just substitute one set of risks for another? Archaeological evidence of ancient water systems and skeletal remains provide clues, but the full epidemiological picture remains a complex area of research, highlighting the pervasive, often silent, suffering caused by unsafe water. So, as you slowly succumb to the gentle pull of sleep, imagine the medieval peasant's constant fear of contaminated water. Every sip, every drink, a potential gamble with debilitating illness or agonizing death. Your access to clean, safe, and abundant drinking water tonight is an unimaginable luxury, a testament to modern sanitation and public health, light years away from the truly awful reality of water in the Middle Ages. Beyond the shared miseries of bland food, precarious preservation, and dangerous water, medieval dining also served as a stark and often brutal reinforcer of the rigid social hierarchy. Imagine sitting at a feast, whether in a grand castle or a humble village hall, and witnessing firsthand how your social status dictated not just what you ate, but how much, and how it was prepared. The table, more than any law, graphically illustrated the vast chasm between the noble and the peasant. At the very top of the social pyramid, the nobility and royalty enjoyed a diet of unparalleled luxury and variety. Imagine a lord's banquet table groaning under the weight of roasted meats. Venison, boar, swan, peacock, often heavily spiced with expensive imported commodities like pepper, cinnamon, and ginger. There would be fine white bread, delicate pastries, and a wide array of exotic fruits fresh or preserved. Wine, not ale, on would flow freely. This lavish spread was a deliberate display of wealth and power, a constant reminder of their elevated status. You would rarely, if ever, taste such culinary opulence. This elite diet is a common historical fact. For the wealthy clergy and high-ranking merchants, the diet was also rich, though perhaps slightly less extravagant than royalty. Imagine them enjoying fine cuts of meat, fresh fish, and pastries, though often bound by religious fasting rules that prohibited meat on certain days. Their access to spices and foreign delicacies would be similar to the nobility, albeit on a slightly smaller scale. Their meals were a symbol of their comfortable, powerful position in society. Then there was the common peasant, which was you. As we've extensively covered, your diet was overwhelmingly monochromatic coarse grain bread, bland pottage, and very little meat. Imagine chewing on your tough, dark bread while hearing tales of your lord feasting on roasted peacock. This stark contrast wasn't just about hunger, it was a constant daily reminder of your low status, your lack of access to luxury, and your place at the bottom of the social ladder. This brutal dietary divide is a stark and constant detail of medieval society. The preparation and presentation of food also highlighted this social divide. Imagine the elaborate, often artistic presentations at a noble's feast. Roasted meats reassembled with their feathers, towering pies, and intricate sugar sculptures. The cooks, often specialized and skilled, would transform simple ingredients into visual spectacles. For you and the peasant, your food would be dumped into a communal pot and served as a uniform. Mushy slop. There was no artistry, no presentation, just raw functionality. This difference in culinary effort and aesthetics is a unique, less common detail. Even the drinking vessels reinforce the hierarchy. Imagine the lord drinking from a silver goblet or a fine earthenware mug. You, the peasant, would likely drink from a simple wooden cup or directly from a communal bowl. The very act of holding your vessel would signify your place in the world. The quality of cooking and dining spaces also differed drastically. Imagine the chaotic but well-staffed castle kitchens with multiple hearths and bustling activity. Dining would take place in a grand hall, often with entertainment. For you, it was your small, smoky hut, or perhaps a crowded communal space with limited light and pervasive smells. The very environment of dining was a physical manifestation of social stratification. A particularly disturbing detail related to this social divide in food was the sumptuary laws. While not always strictly enforced, some medieval societies enacted laws that dictated what certain social classes were allowed to eat or wear. Imagine a law forbidding you, a peasant, from eating fine white bread or wearing certain types of cloth, even if you could somehow afford it. These laws weren't about health. They were about reinforcing social boundaries, preventing those of lower status from mimicking the elite, and maintaining the visible signs of hierarchy. The very food on your plate was regulated by your birth. A significant academic debate among food historians concerns the degree to which diet affected social mobility. Did the nutritional deficiencies of the peasant diet inherently limit their physical and intellectual development, making it harder for them to escape their class? While direct causation is hard to prove, it's clear that the combination of harsh labor, poor diet, and pervasive illness created a vicious cycle that kept the peasantry largely bound to their inherited status. The stomach was often a subtle yet powerful tool of social control. So, as you slowly succumb to the gentle pull of sleep, imagine the medieval table, a brutal stage for the performance of social hierarchy. From the lavish feasts of the nobility to the monotonous slop of the peasantry, every meal was a stark reminder of who you were, what you had, and what you could never aspire to. Your freedom to choose your own food tonight, from a world of culinary delights, is an unimaginable privilege compared to the strictly stratified and often awful dining reality of the Middle Ages. As you finally drift into the profound silence of sleep, let's bring our journey through why food was awful in the Middle Ages to a close. Take a moment to reflect on the immense daily struggles, the hidden dangers, and the pervasive monotony that defined the medieval diet. Forget any lingering romantic notions of hearty feasts. The true story is one of continuous culinary challenge, often leading to profound misery and precarious survival. The medieval table, for the vast majority of people, was a place of monotony. You've imagined the endless cycle of coarse grain bread and bland pottage, day in and day out, with very little variation. The absence of exotic spices, reserved for the wealthy, meant meals lacked vibrancy and excitement, serving purely as fuel for a life of relentless labor. This pervasive blandness and repetition were a silent form of culinary torment. The constant battle against spoilage and rot without refrigeration was a core challenge. You've pictured the arduous processes of salting and drying, which, while preserving food, stripped it of its fresh flavors and rendered it tough and intensely salty. The underlying threat of rancidity, hidden within preserved fats, added another layer of unpleasantness and potential illness to every bite. Even more insidious was the rampant practice of food adulteration. You've imagined unscrupulous merchants adding fillers like sawdust or chalk to bread, or dangerous substances like lead to wine. This widespread fraud meant that medieval food was often a hidden poison, unknowingly consumed, contributing to chronic illnesses and health issues with no real regulation or consumer protection. The lack of basic hygiene in food preparation was a constant recipe for sickness. You've seen kitchens with open hearths, unwashed hands, and pervasive vermin, where contaminated water was used for cooking. Every meal was a gamble with waterborne diseases and food poisoning, making dining a hazardous activity and contributing significantly to the short lifespans of the era. And the cycle of seasonal scarcity and constant hunger was a defining, brutal reality. You've imagined the gnawing emptiness of the lean months, the desperate reliance on a single annual harvest, and the terrifying prospect of famine that could force people to consume famine foods, inedible and often harmful substitutes. Life was a continuous balancing act on the brink of starvation. This leads to a significant academic debate among food historians. What was the true caloric and nutritional adequacy of the medieval diet? While it might have provided enough calories for physical labor, its lack of variety and inherent contamination often led to widespread chronic deficiencies. Scholars continue to analyze skeletal remains and historical records to understand the precise impact of these dietary realities on medieval health and longevity, offering a grimmer yet more accurate picture. Ultimately, medieval food was a brutal reflection of its time, a struggle for survival in a world of limited technology, pervasive scarcity, and a profound lack of scientific understanding. The vast majority of people ate to live, not to enjoy, and their meals were often a source of discomfort, illness, and constant anxiety. So, as the quiet hours of the night gently embrace you, and the images of bland pottage and questionable bread fade from your mind, let your body relax into peaceful sleep. The echoes of hunger, spoilage, and hidden poisons are gone, replaced by the gentle hum of your fan. Your comfortable but well-fed sleep tonight, with access to a bounty of fresh, safe, and delicious foods from around the world, is an unimaginable miracle compared to the truly awful reality of food in the Middle Ages. Drift now into a deep and restorative slumber, grateful for the culinary abundance and safety of your modern world.